Today we have back Professor at John Jay College, Milton Allimadi, and most, I think, in my opinion, most importantly, the host of African History Club, which is a fantastic podcast about African history. You can be a Patreon of it. I'm a Patreon of it. I recommend all of you become Patreons of it.
Thank you.
Welcome back, man.
Hey, cool. Thanks for having me again.
So it's crazy, dude. That video, those videos about Milton Allimadi that we did really blew up. So it's
Well, let's keep it going.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Let's keep it going. So like most countries, most countries in the world, but particularly in Africa, you have to unfortunately start the history of any conversation about any figure or country with the occupation by another country.
Right.
So we're going to talk about Patrice Lumumba, but of course, like our last discussion about Burkina Faso, we're going to have to start with the Belgium occupation in the Congo. And I guess just to paint a picture of its brutality, of its sort of ruthlessness, that was very, just to paint the picture of what the Congo came from. Maybe you could get into King Leopold and some of his practices and stuff like that.
Yes, absolutely. Um, and it's to me, it's always sad when I'm speaking about the Congo or Ghana because I think the most severe blow that Africa suffered uh, was the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in 1961 and the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah in 1966. And in both cases, with the involvement of the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department. And I say this because Patrice Lumumba was inspired greatly by Kwame Nkrumah. And Kwame Nkrumah, of course, wanted to unite the continent into one United States of Africa. He studied in the United States. That's where he did his undergrad. He went to Lincoln University, which is a historically Black university. And then he went to UPenn, and then he went to the United Kingdom, where he finished his studies. So he was very familiar with how imperialism works, and he had lived in the belly of the beast. And he clearly understood that the only way Africa would be able to protect its independence and not just have a meaningless independence, because he had also seen how the US was manipulating South America and knew that the same thing would happen to Africa. So his vision for Africa was critical, the most critical, actually, I would say. There were others like Julius Nyerere, Sekou Touré, but I think Nkrumah was paramount. So removing Nkrumah from the historical stage really disrupted Africa's opportunities, really.
Mhm.
And then the removal of Lumumba, it provided the template for further undermining of other African countries, because then we saw a series of coups d'etats just proliferating across the continent in the 1960s. And independence became completely meaningless. But
Right,
in order to get even to that stage, I agree with you, we need to go back into the history.
right.
At the time of the Berlin Conference of November 1884 to February 1885, when that conference formalized the partition of Africa. Britain, you get, these territories. Germany, the host, you get these territories. Belgium, you get these territories, and so forth. They partitioned the entire continent. Um, Spain, Portugal, all of them got a piece of the continent. And by that time, Leopold, the King of Belgium, Leopold II, had already been, foraging into the continent using people like Henry Morton Stanley, the American so-called journalist. He was not a journalist. He was just purely a bandit. He wrote about how he really enjoyed shooting Africans, people that didn't even know him or did no harm to him, just shooting them like, wild game. He boasted of that in his writings. He signed so-called treaties with the various rulers in the geographical location which is now occupied by what we call the Congo in Africa. And these treaties were just equivalent to the kind of so-called treaties signed with leaders of Native American nations in what is now the United States. They were worthless, just a confirmation of banditry. So the conference in Berlin just basically formalized his so-called ownership of that territory. And as you noted in the beginning, yes, his regime was so homicidal, and there have been many accounts about it. We don't need to go into the details. The estimated number of people killed, 10 million. The most chilling photographs of the people who were maimed. People can find that in many history books, even a Google search, Congolese maimed during Leopold's reign would yield some of those horrific pictures. Right. And these were Congolese communities who did not fulfill their regular quota. I don't know whether it was weekly or monthly or whatever the period was. It did not produce enough rubber. Rubber was a very precious commodity in those days before a lot of the synthetics came into being. Rubber and of course, ivory. So they had either a hand or a foot chopped off, even including children, to terrify and incentivize other Congolese to produce more. Mark Twain wrote a satirical piece like about a trial of King Leopold. In 1905, he wrote it called King Leopold's Soliloquy. And people can also, research and see that. Even the United States media that supported imperialism, like the New York Times, right, wrote editorials, promoting European imperialism in Africa. Even the New York Times wrote about how horrific King Leopold was. So that just gives you an indication of how bad he really was. Other European imperial powers who were also committing crimes in Africa and had seized territory condemned him as well. Right. His was beyond the pale. So then, of course, in their wisdom, the Belgian state came up with a solution. And the solution obviously was not to free the Congolese, but the solution was to transfer the administration of the territory to the Belgian state. So instead of King Leopold's private property, it became a colony, the Belgian state. So there was only a transfer of deed, and the atrocities continued. But things changed dramatically in Africa, particularly after World War II, when many of the Africans who fought on behalf of empire, who fought in Europe, who fought in the Far East, even though they had nothing to do with the disputes going on, they didn't even know what the argument was about. Right. But they just happened to be subjugated by the imperial power, so they were conscripted to fight into either the British army or the French army or the German army in the case of German colonies. When they came back, the ones who were lucky enough to come back alive, right, it is a story that is not well told, and perhaps in a future episode we could actually spend some time onto that, because I think they deserve that recognition. Absolutely. Millions of Africans were conscripted to go and fight, and many died, but the ones that came back had a very different mindset. They were not willing to just come back to return to being, as a Kenyan um, colonialist who was interviewed in this documentary about the Kenyan resistance, said, call them fifth-class citizens in their own country. So they were not willing to go back to become fifth-class citizens. Right. And they started agitating for, for nationalism and for independence. And that is why I mentioned him earlier, because Kwame Nkrumah was at the lead of all this. And so successful that in 1951, 52, Ghana won what they called internal self-government. So in essence, almost independent, except the British colonials still handled defense and international affairs. And obviously this provided great impetus to the independence movement in other African countries, including the Congo. And then finally, Ghana won its complete independence. Well, complete formal independence. I have to make that distinction.
Right.
In 1957. And that really set the momentum on high gear in most African countries, including the Congo. And in the Congo, Patrice Lumumba emerged into the forefront of the struggle for independence. He was largely like Malcolm X, self-educated, really, right. Because the Belgians were the worst in terms of denying. The Belgians and the Portuguese actually were the worst in terms of denying educational opportunity to Africans, because obviously they had no plans of leaving. There was a Belgian who was supposedly, I forget his name, a professor, supposedly liberal, and he wrote what was considered an important paper. And he suggested that the Congo would probably win its independence within the next century, within 100 years. And he was criticized for making such a reckless prediction. This was in the 1950s, you see? So, and, obviously, he was enlightened, but he was not even enlightened enough because the Congo won its independence by 1960. But before we got there, the elements of the trouble that was to come had already started rearing its head. So Lumumba led the party called.
Okay. So this is where the next question goes into. You summarized that history very well, and I also want to say I think it's good that you sort of just gave the broad strokes on what happened with Leopold and all that, because I think it's sometimes fetishized, like how bad the United States has been in certain countries, like in a weird, perverse way. And I don't want to like replicate that, but I do feel like I just feel like it's a good place to just say the number of people that were victims of King Leopold and of the Belgian government. And so I'm just really glad you did that. So yeah, Lumumba founded the MNC. Correct. In 1958. What was the MNC and what was its role in Lumumba's life and in the Congo? And real quick, I'm going to cut this out of the video, but I just got to say, I'm going to have to, when it hits 10 minutes, I'm going to have to run and grab my debit card because Zoom makes it if you want to do a long 4-minute. Because
no, I mean, if you want me to shorten the presentation, we can fit it within your time if you want. It's fine with me.
Okay, I mean, yeah, just make sure you get everything, because I mean, I have to eventually pay money anyway because I want my interviews to be longer than 40 minutes. But like,
oh, fine, I'll keep it, very focused and quick.
Gotcha. Yeah. Because Zoom's got shareholders.
Yeah, I know, of course, I understand.
But but yeah, so
right.
What was the MNC and what was its role in Lumumba's government?
Right, and as the name indicates, the Movement National Congolese. It was actually at that time the only nationally oriented political party. The others were more regionally based, like CONACAT, which is the one which was headed by Moise Tshombe, who later became the prime agent of Western imperialism and undermined Congo's independence, really. So Lumumba had a nationalist outlook because he was inspired by Nkrumah. And to him, the independence of Congo was just one stage into the total independence of all African countries and then the unity of all African countries. He was basically an Nkrumahist. And obviously, imperialism did not like this. So they were very disappointed and tried to, in fact, remove him from the political scene. He was locked up because the year before the elections that led to independence, the elections in early 1960, he had been locked up after there were protests that he helped organize, national protests. And they arrested him after there were some deaths. In fact, the Belgians, colonial police, killed Congolese, then they blamed Lumumba. So they locked him up. But even in prison, he was much more powerful, just as Nkrumah. Nkrumah actually won his seat in parliament, and his party won when he was locked up by the British colonials. So locking them up just actually enhanced their credibility and power. So his party won, and they could not keep him out of the equation anymore. So he was released, and he went to Brussels, where they were having the round table for independence, and that's where they negotiated the post-colonial era in the Congo. But obviously, the Belgians did not want to leave because Congo at that time was not only a producer of rubber. As I said, rubber had been increasingly displaced, but now valuable mineral resources. At that time, copper was the leading commodity, but even the uranium used in the US atom bomb was mined from the Congo, and many other minerals that had just started becoming recognized.
Apologies for interrupting, but
No, not at all.
isn't coltan mostly found just
Yes,
in the Congo?
that is today. At that
Okay,
time, that was early 60s, but today it is coltan, it is cobalt. In fact, Congo is even much more critical now to the West, as you know, because of electric cars.
Electric cars, yeah.
Yes, and Congo holds perhaps as much as 60% of the world's
Wow.
known reserves. So the key thing here that we can actually digress a little is to tell our comrades listening is that once Congo, and eventually it will be, properly managed by African administration who wants to serve the interest of the citizens of Congo, the Congo will thrive and all other African countries, because Congo alone can actually help transform the lives of Africans in every African country. That's how richly endowed in resources it is. The hydroelectric power potential alone can electrify the entire African continent. And this is something that was known even in the 1960s. And that's why there's always been this struggle for the Congo. So Mobutu was promoted to eventually kill Lumumba. When the Congo won its independence, the army was largely still administered by Europeans, and the junior ranks started agitating. They wanted African commanders. So Lumumba promoted Joseph Desire Mobutu, who was part of his political party, but unknown to Lumumba. Mobutu was already on the payroll of the CIA as of 1959. He had been recruited while he had made a visit to Belgium. So that's where he was recruited in 1959. Lumumba did not know this, of course. So ultimately, as the Belgians wanted to promote Moise Tshombe to launch his secession, they used some of the mutinies in the army when the lower ranks were rebelling and saying, we really need Africanized officers. They used that as an excuse to send their soldiers back into the Congo. and primarily through the Katanga region, which was controlled by most Shombe. And they used the pretext of wanting to protect the lives of Europeans to intervene. And now Lumumba is dealing with two crises. You have a secession supported by Belgium going on in Katanga. You have mutinies going on in your own national army. Right. So he invited the United Nations to come and help suppress the rebellion and the secession. The UN, of course, as you know, is controlled by the superpowers. And in those days, the United States had a very strong influence, even stronger than it has today, over the United Nations. Mm-hmm. And they basically played neutral, which really undermined Lumumba's government. And the secession kept growing, the rebellions, the mutinies kept growing. And they used this chaos that they had themselves generated to say that Lumumba could not run the country. Mm-hmm. And they then gave Mobutu the orders to overthrow the government, which he did in September 1960, just 3 months after independence. So Lumumba's supporters had managed to help him to initially escape, but then there's an account where he actually turned up when he was being pursued by by Mobutu soldiers in front of a United Nations garrison, and they refused to allow him to enter, knowing what was going to happen to him.
Right.
So by turning him down, he was captured. He was delivered back to Mobutu in Leopoldville, which is now Kinshasa. Mm-hmm. And there's that horrific scene, film reel, where you see them, soldiers trying to stuff paper into his mouth. It's a scene that is widely available. It's a scene that's very difficult for me to watch. Yeah. And that was actually the speech that he had made, a very famous speech, because at the time of the independence celebration, King Baudouin of the Belgians came and he made a speech basically exalting his ancestor, King Leopold, saying he had started this great mission to civilize Congolese. So when Lumumba got up, he said, "This is not true. Yes, we want to have friendly, brotherly relations, but we have to remember the history. Mm-hmm. It was bloodshed, it was suffering, it was exploitation, it was humiliation. So yes, now we are very proud to be independent, but we did shed blood for our independence. Right. Going forward, of course, we want to be equals." And that speech also sealed its fate. At that time, the Belgian colonial administration decided that by all means, we need to get rid of somebody who dares to insult our king in front of other Africans by speaking truth to power. Yeah. So when he was delivered to Shombe, he was killed. He was, first of all, beaten viciously. He was beaten when he was on the plane being flown to be delivered to his killers. Right. He was barely conscious when he was delivered there. He was beaten viciously again, to almost death, actually. And then he was led to a firing squad and tied up. And he refused, of course, to be blindfolded. And he was shot and killed. And his body was dismembered. It was crushed, the bones crushed, and it was dissolved in acid. Why? Because they did not even want the Congolese to be able to say that we come here at this location where our founding father is buried. They thought it would be used to mobilize opposition against imperialism. So that's why they decided to disappear the body, you know? Mm-hmm. What survived is supposedly a tooth. That tooth was taken back to Belgium. This month, I understand that tooth is supposed to be returned to the Congo. And there's going to be a big ceremony to welcome returns of the remains of Patrice Lumumba. And those so-called remains a single tooth. So now that Lumumba is removed from the historical scene, I think Kwame Nkrumah knew at that time that eventually they would come for him as well.
Mhm.
Kwame Nkrumah made a speech after the assassination of Lumumba at the United Nations, and he accused, the the culprits involved, the United States, uh, Britain, and
Britain.
France as well. France was also involved in addition to Belgium. And a few months ago, I went to this website that somebody had alerted me to. I think it's called state.history.gov. It is the historical documents depository of the State Department. And it has some amazing documents, including of the accounts of how the United States was involved in the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah in the most plain language. So for example, after the speech he made at the United Nations, they essentially said, no, he's got to go. And they started working to undermine him. And it's so chilling to read the language. It's being discussed like an ordinary conversation. Let's use the fact that the World Bank loaned him money. Let's block the disbursement of those funds. So let's cause economic crises.
Yeah.
And that eventually will encourage the police and the military to overthrow him. And they speak it and write about it in plain language. And it's on that website, state.history.gov. And eventually it did get to him. And in 1966, he was removed from the historical stage. And that's why I started from the beginning by saying that was the most severe blow to Africa in terms of the unity of Africa, the viability of Africa to actually be independent, not independent on paper alone, but use the resources to build up Africa's economy. By removing Lumumba and Kwame Nkrumah, that set the template for the multiple other coups d'etat we saw in Africa. That is why today in the 21st century, the continent remains like these balkanized 54 nations that have no power individually, but collectively could have tremendous power.
Wow. Do you want to know how I know you're a great guest for interviews? Is that I had 6 questions written down, and I asked 2 of them, and you somehow answered every single one of my other unasked questions in your answer. Like legitimately, pretty much like the Mobutu coup. I suppose one thing I'll ask you really quick: what did Mobutu mean when he said technicians will run our administration? Is this sort of like a proto-technocracy kind of guy then, or what?
No. Mobutu, actually, it's interesting because he seemed to be a person who was actually pretty clever.
Yeah.
He had done some writing also and some editing, and seemed to be conscious about the world and Africa's position and location in historical terms. But I think he was extremely greedy.
Yeah.
So we never really got to know the true Mobutu at all, because he was compromised at a very early stage in 1960. So up to date, I don't think the story of who Mobutu could have been has ever been written.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
so to be honest with you, I don't know who Mobutu really is. I just know him as this guy who became really an assassin and a thug and just a corrupt dictator for 37 years, amassed a fortune estimated at $5 billion.
Right.
Well,
what's interesting about that is, would it be fair to say that in many ways, that Mobutu is sort of the Congo's William O'Neill?
Absolutely.
And because it's just like I personally think like the assassination of Fred Hampton was like one of the biggest losses in American history, just with how powerful he was and how much he was able to to really unite people and speak to people's
Yes,
needs in that very Marxist, Maoist sort of, you know, like he was very convincing. Uh,
yes,
and and
yes, I
yeah,
agree with you. Yes,
and I
yes,
think we could say the same thing about Lumumba. And then you have this guy who's motivated by other things, and
yeah.
in some respect, just
And
sort of
was part of his
apolitical.
inner circle too,
Right.
part of
Yeah, yeah.
his
Just like
circle, you know,
yeah,
commander of his old army, imagine, you know.
just like
Oh man,
William O'Neill was the
that's
commander
a
of
good
the
analogy. I never even thought of it that way, but that's excellent.
yeah. Well, honestly, I'm thinking Kwame Nkrumah is the next episode we should do.
Sure, absolutely. Why
Yeah.
not?
Thank you
Because
so
then that
much.
ties it forever.
Yeah,
Ties it forever.
that was great. Like that was like everything that I mean, I want to obviously go a lot more in depth in you know, when we have time, but that was like a really great summary. And that's the thing is like you know all these little you know how to explain it so it's not super complicated. You look up like any sort of historical text, whether it's like Wikipedia or like an actual source. Like
Right.
it's hard to understand when you're reading it, like all these
Yeah,
different little like all these
right.
different pieces, all these people,
I
all
agree
these
with you. You have
right,
to be relatable and connected,
right, and you do a
to
great
make
job of breaking that
it.
down. So
Thank you. Thank you so much. Man.
alrighty, well, thank you. One before I go, you should plug African History Club because I did at the top of
Yes,
it, and you can probably
yes,
give a better plug.
yes, absolutely. I encourage viewers, listeners to go to my Patreon, African History Club, and I've done 34 episodes now,
Mhm.
starting from the origins of human beings on the African continent, going through the early cultures and civilizations in Africa, going to the evolution of empires in West Africa, in Central Africa, in Southern Africa, on the East African coast, and then going to the period of enslavement and the destruction of the continent, weakening the continent, paving the way for the colonial invasion, and then going through the colonial era, going through the nationalism, some of which we just discussed today, going through independence, and now we are dealing with the meaninglessness of independence as we discuss the neo-colonial era now.
Right.
So I invite people to support and become a member. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'll just stop the recording here and